This paper originated as a talk that John and I gave at a conference on consciousness some years ago at the University of Mississippi. Galen Strawson was there. I don't remember whether Michelle was there or not, but Galen was there and gave a talk as well. And there was supposed to be a volume to come out of that, but for some reason that never happened. And so this paper, at the time it was merely a talk by John and me, but it became a paper later when I spent some time in Memphis with John and Nancy, and we prosified it. And the plan is to put this paper into a collection of phenomenal intentionality papers by John and myself and George Graham. And George and I are hoping to do that before too very long. The ideas in this paper are probably 80% John Teenson and 20% Terry Horgan. Okay, I think I'm going to read along, but I've got the main sections and main ideas from the sections on the handout. Okay, here we go. Phenomenal intentionality and the intrinsicness holism dilemma. That's part one. A number of philosophers, ourselves included, advocate the phenomenal intentionality thesis, which we call PI in the paper, which asserts that the fundamental kind of intentionality or aboutness is the intentionality of occurrent conscious states or processes. We take this to imply that phenomenal intentionality is both intrinsic and basic. Intrinsic means that since consciousness is intrinsic to the conscious state or process itself, phenomenal intentionality is intrinsic to the conscious state or process and therefore is narrow. It does not depend constitutively on anything outside of that conscious state or process. Basic, all other states and processes properly called intentional derive their intentionality at least in part from phenomenal intentionality. This includes the intentionality of language, the intentionality of not presently occurrent memories, beliefs, desires, plans, and so forth. We take it that this was simply taken for granted in the milieu around the turn of the 20th century when Brentano, Husserl, Russell, Moore, James, and others were all talking to each other. It was then that the word intentionality and its cognates re-entered the philosophical vocabulary. We ourselves have also maintained from when we first articulated and defended the phenomenal intentionality thesis that phenomenal intentionality of the kind instantiated in humans can only occur within the context of a wider cognitive system, a system with the capacity to undergo a whole range of distinct phenomenal intentional states and processes other than the one you're in now. This makes phenomenal intentionality a somewhat holistic matter. Undergoing a specific occurrent phenomenal intentional state or process constitutively requires the capacity to undergo a variety of distinct and not currently occurrent phenomenal states or processes. There's a prima facie tension here. How can the phenomenal intentionality of a currently occurrent conscious state or process be intrinsic to that state or process itself if its having that specific content depends constitutively on the cognitive system's capacity to undergo a wider range of other not currently occurrent conscious phenomenal states or processes? Addressing this conundrum, which we'll call the intrinsicness holism dilemma, is our project here. Part two, holistic issues. There are various ways in which the intentionality of phenomenal intentional states seems to depend constitutively on aspects of the cognitive system apart from the currently occurrent conscious state or process. We'll mention three of the most prominent ones. First is holism, narrowly so called. Very often one can undergo a particular intentional state or process only if one is capable of undergoing many other content-wise related ones. For example, one can only add 5 and 7 to get 12 if one is capable of many other arithmetical beliefs and computations. One can only plan to go to the bank to make a deposit if one has many other beliefs concerning financial institutions, modes of transportation, the nature and uses of money, and so forth. Second is background understanding. One can think about certain kinds of activities, for instance, only if one has a background understanding of how such activities are performed, and normally at least only if one has the ability to perform the activity itself. Thinking about going to the bank involves understanding driving. Thinking about going upstairs to get one's checkbook involves understanding going upstairs. Such background understanding does not consist merely of beliefs and probably cannot be fully articulated, even in principle, as a set of propositions. Third is concept-infused perception. The content of one's perceptual beliefs, perceptual states and processes, content some of which normally becomes the content of current perceptual beliefs, is very rich. For instance, one sees, literally sees as such, persons, particular individuals, an audience, border collies herding sheep. Since one's perceptual states and processes have this kind of content, those states and processes deploy pertinent concepts, and one cannot possess those concepts without being capable of undergoing many other states, not presently conscious, that deploy those and similar concepts. None of this is rampant holism. In each case, what is constitutively required is limited in one way or another to the subject matter of the occurrent conscious state or process. But it is holism nonetheless, and enough so to give rise to the intrinsicness holism dilemma. Part 3, possible responses, possible ways of dealing with this dilemma. There are 4 types of response to this dilemma that an advocate of phenomenal intentionality might make. In principle, one could adopt different ones for different cases. The options are as follows. First, deny the holism requirement simpliciter. Argue, for example, that there can be punctate minds, or that such a thing as the background is not required. A punctate mind would have just the one occurrent phenomenally intentional state and could have it without having the capacity for other phenomenally intentional states. Second alternative, deny that the holism requirement is metaphysical. Claim, for example, that the requirement is merely causal, not metaphysical. It's a fact about the human kind of mind that it could not just add 5 and 12 without being capable of other such calculations, but that's because humans must learn to do it. Likewise, one could not see border collies herding sheep without a slew of beliefs about animals, but that's because of the way humans acquire concepts. Third response, modify phenomenal intentionality. Say, for example, that the phenomenal intentionality of the currently conscious state or process is determined not by its phenomenal character alone, but rather by further possible phenomenal states and processes and/or by background understanding that it's constituted by certain dispositions to undergo transitions from one phenomenal state to another. Phenomenal intentionality could still be narrow, depending constitutively only on features internal to the cognitive system, yet it also would be somewhat relative or non-intrinsic, since the phenomenal intentionality of a given phenomenal intentional state or process would be constitutively determined not by the intrinsic phenomenal character of one's total occurrent conscious state and process itself, but only by that lost my visual horizontal processing, but only by that occurrent intrinsic phenomenality together with the intrinsic phenomenality of other potential phenomenal states and processes, and/or with certain background appropriate potential transitions from one such phenomenal state or process to another. And then there's a fourth way of dealing with the dilemma, rich content. Maintain that phenomenology is richer in content and character than it is given credit for, in such a way that a creature who undergoes such phenomenology has both the required kinds of cognitive capacities and the required kinds of additional potential mental states or processes. In other words, the occurrent phenomenal state is so rich that somehow you couldn't be in it without having all these required additional capacities. We ourselves favor the fourth option, rich content option, which we believe is applicable to all instances of phenomenal intentionality. The remainder of this paper will be aimed at making this stance look plausible and attractive. Doing so will involve two tasks. First, making plausible the claim that phenomenology is much richer in content and character than it's usually thought to be. And second, making plausible the claim that such richness in the intrinsic phenomenal character of total conscious states or processes suffices to secure the requisite degree of holism in any cognitive system that instantiates these kinds of states and processes. So first we do the first task, and then we do the second. The first task is to urge that there are largely unappreciated phenomenal riches. So this is section 4, called Phenomenal Riches. All these examples that we're working through come from John. I really like, on the one hand, how homey they are, and on the other hand, how well they illustrate the phenomenal riches that he takes them to illustrate. Here we'll highlight 3 ways in which phenomenology is richer than is usually noticed, as a first step toward addressing the intrinsicness holism dilemma. First is hidden conceptual phenomenology. When I add a column of figures, it goes as follows. I say to myself, John puts the say in quotes, the running total as I go down the right side column, looking in turn at the right side digit of each successive number. So for example, in adding 26, 21, 18, 31, 25, I'd say to myself, 7, 15, 16, 21, and then write 1 at the bottom of the right-hand column. Now proceeding downward through the next left column, I might also say, carry 2, 4, 6, 7, and so forth. Although I successively look at and hence see the successive numerals in a certain order, and I successively say the running sum as I add, at least sort of mentally saying it, I do not say plus or and or addition rules or anything of that sort at each step. Thus, there's nothing vocally or subvocally auditory at each step, and also nothing visual corresponding to the operation of addition as such. But of course, I'm adding, and I know that I'm adding. That I am adding is itself an aspect of the overall intentionality of my conscious cognitive process. An important lesson of such hidden phenomenology is that there's such a thing, is that there's something that it's like in this experience to deploy the concept plus, something that is neither visual sensory nor auditory imagistic, and that therefore deserves to be called cognitive phenomenology. But the main lesson for present purposes is that in the calculating activity, an intentional aspect of one's overall occurrent phenomenology is that one is employing the concept plus. Although each successive step is a separate mental act, phenomenologically it's also part of adding a column of figures. And as one goes down the column, one need not know what numerals come later. And hence, one must be experientially poised to perform any potential further addition step. That one is so poised at that moment, and that one has that capacity at the moment, both are intentional aspects at that moment of one's overall occurrent conscious state or process at the moment. A second type of phenomenal richness, so this first type, again, is hidden conceptual phenomenology. Okay. A second type of phenomenal richness is the conceptual richness of perceptual phenomenology. When one sees a familiar kind artifact, such as a blender or a bathtub or a laptop computer, one doesn't undergo an experience as of noticing certain visually presented shapes and colors at various visually presented locations, and then consciously inferring that what's present is a blender or a bathtub, etc. Rather, the item is immediately presented visually experientially as a blender or a bathtub or whatever. Likewise, for numerous kinds of visually presented items other than artifacts. Likewise, too, for numerous kinds of visually presented complex situations, as when, for example, one sees border collies herding sheep, or one sees a cleanly executed play-action pass in a football game. John was a real connoisseur of sports, and he drew a lot of great examples from sports. One can't see a blender as a blender without knowing a fair amount about what blenders are for and how they are used. Likewise for bathtubs, laptop computers, and other artifacts. One can't see border collies herding sheep without knowing a fair amount about dogs in general, about sheep in general, about collies in particular, including that they are dogs, and about the human purposes associated with sheep herding. Conceptual penetration of perceptual phenomenology is extensive and ubiquitous, so much so that it's easy to overlook. That's why it takes enormous skill to see one's surrounding environment as a congeries of spatially distributed colored shapes, as does an impressionist painter. So that's the second kind of richness, the conceptual richness of perceptual phenomenology. Third is non-focal appreciation of context. Here comes some more sports now. The batter focuses intently as the pitch is made, trying to pick up the release point and then the spin of the ball. I asked John, how do you pick up the spin of the ball, especially since it gets from there to here in something less than a second? He said something about focusing on the twine that holds the leather onto the baseball and how, when it's spinning, whether it's a tight little dot or whether it's a slightly bigger spinning twine, I guess that could tell a really skilled baseball player something about the spin of the baseball. Anyway, but even in this intensely focused physical perceptual event, the batter's overall conscious experience is as of playing baseball. And he's non-focally aware of a great deal of the game situation: score, inning, number of outs, runners on base, alignment of the field, who is pitching, and more. You always know what you're doing. As this example illustrates, conscious experiences occur not just against a background of mental capacities, but also within a non-focal and yet conscious appreciation of context. To underscore this point in a different way involving temporality, consider walking upstairs. As you do so, the most that can be present in your immediate perceptual and bodily consciousness is what's going on within the duration of about one step. But consciously taking that step is only the experience that it is within the context of peripheral awareness that you are walking up the stairs. Okay, returning to the rich content strategy for addressing the intrinsicness holism dilemma, it now becomes plausible that the phenomenal character of one's overall conscious state or process at any given short span of time typically is highly suffused with intentional aspects that present one's having the capacity to undergo numerous potential not now occurrent conscious states and processes that are content related in various ways to the content of the now occurrent overall conscious state or process. That is, one's overall conscious state process has truth or satisfaction conditions that require the possession of such capacities. The first two kinds of rich content bring in such holism involving truth satisfaction conditions quite directly. And the third kind brings in yet more of it, because non-focal appreciation of context includes being poised to adapt mentally to a host of potential but not actual new experiential inputs, such as new sensory perceptual experiences. So the upshot is that the first of the two tasks mentioned at the end of section 3 has been accomplished. We've argued that there really is quite rich content in a current phenomenal intentional experience, more so than might initially be thought. But the second task still remains to be addressed, namely arguing that this rich content secures that the system actually meets the requisite holistic instantiation conditions. Okay, now as I remember, I'm talking to John about this stuff at his house with Nancy, and I start raising analytic philosophy quibbles. And as I recall, he got a little irritated, grumbling about analytic philosophy quibbles. Nevertheless, they were in my mind, and some of them, I guess, I think really are pretty important to inject here. So section 5 involves some of these worries. Section 5 is called Skeptical Doubts About the Rich Content Strategy, Instantiation Conditions versus Truth Satisfaction Conditions. Early in the paper, we described the kind of holism that generates the intrinsicness holism dilemma. Undergoing a specific occurrent phenomenal intentional state process constitutively requires the capacity to undergo a variety of distinct, not currently occurrent phenomenal states or processes. This constitutively required capacity is not just a matter of one's total occurrent conscious state or process having truth satisfaction conditions whose content is as of one's having that capacity. Rather, it's a matter of one's actually having it. As we'll put this point, the requisite capacity figures constitutively in the instantiation conditions of the total occurrent conscious state or process, which means that one cannot instantiate that state or process unless one actually possesses the pertinent capacity. Now, given this distinction between instantiation conditions and truth or satisfaction conditions, together with the fact that holism pertains to instantiation conditions, a skeptical worry naturally arises concerning the second task that needs to be accomplished in order to implement the rich content strategy for diffusing the intrinsicness holism dilemma. The worry is just this: a conscious mental state or process can have a particular intentional content involving particular truth or satisfaction conditions without being veridical. In other words, without those truth or satisfaction conditions actually being met. That being so, the fact that one's total occurrent conscious state or process presents one's having the capacity to undergo a wide variety of distinct potential conscious states or processes that are not now occurrent supplies no guarantee at all that one actually has that capacity. In other words, possession of those rich truth satisfaction conditions supplies no guarantee at all that the constitutive holistic instantiation conditions are met. Yet such a guarantee is precisely what's required in order to successfully implement the rich content strategy for diffusing the intrinsicness holism dilemma. You know, the worry is, well, maybe my experience presents me as having all these additional capacities, but perhaps I don't really have them, right? Maybe it's non-veridical in that respect. It might be argued that there's more than just a worry here. A more thoroughly skeptical view would go as follows. First, the very idea of deploying a rich content strategy rests on a hopeless conflation between instantiation conditions and truth satisfaction conditions. Second, once this conflation is brought to light, it becomes virtually self-evident that no matter how rich is the content of a specific total occurrent conscious state or process, possession of that content by itself, by the single state, simply can't guarantee that the holistic instantiation conditions for the state process are met by the creature who's undergoing it. Well, we acknowledge the initial plausibility of this skeptical position, but we regard it not as a refutation, but rather as a legitimate challenge, a challenge that clarifies the nature of the second task we're pursuing, namely trying to appeal to the rich content of a current phenomenal intentional experience to argue that you couldn't have such an experience without actually having these related capacities and the potential to undergo certain related non-actual and phenomenal intentional states. Okay, section 6, an implementation sketch for the rich content strategy. First, we want to sort of sketch out the logic of a way of trying to implement this strategy, and then we're going to try to put some meat on the bones of the sketched out approach. So section 6 is the sketch. Okay. Bearing in mind the skeptical doubts articulated in section 5, we offer the following as a proposed implementation sketch. Let's see, do I have that on the handout? Yeah, I do, section 6, okay. First, maintain that phenomenology is richer in character and content than is given credit for. That we've already done. That is, maintain that the intrinsic phenomenal character of the state process by itself already is inherently so intentionally rich that its overall intentionality includes truth satisfaction conditions requiring that there are potential further states or processes and potential further transitions over such states and processes of the relevant kind. Got to be part of the content. Okay. Second, maintain that at least some of this rich content is defeasibly self-certifying in this sense. Barring the presence of some non-conscious factor that's poised to interfere with the cognitive system's operation, a state process just cannot possess this aspect of rich content without thereby being guaranteed to meet the content aspect's truth satisfaction conditions. Third, maintain that processing rich content with these first two features defeasibly guarantees that a creature who instantiates the given state process also has whatever additional mental features and capacities are required by the instantiation conditions for that very state or process. So that's a sketch of how we propose to implement the rich content strategy for diffusing the intrinsicness holism dilemma. Before we get to more detail, a little bit about what sorts of defeasibility conditions we have in mind. Here again, I was injecting some stuff from familiar analytic philosophy. I was thinking about the literature, the recent literature in the free will debate about scenarios. What are they called? They all derive from cases originally invented by Harry Frankfurt. Manipulation scenarios, they're called. They dominate far too much the recent literature on free will, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, that's what was in my mind when I was raising the skeptical worry that we're talking about. Okay, what kind of defeasibility conditions? Capacities often are construed as involving pertinent dispositions. In that spirit, cognitive capacities are plausibly construed as involving pertinent cognitive dispositions, dispositions to undergo certain non-actual cognitive states or processes under various counterfactual circumstances. But the exercise of cognitive dispositions can be disrupted in various ways, say by external interference, being hit by a bus, or by internal physical breakdown, having a stroke. Cognitive dispositions also can be finked. I don't know who first invented that term, but there's a whole literature on finked dispositions. Roughly, this is a matter of some factor being already in place, external to the cognitive system itself, which is already guaranteed to prevent the exercise, at least in some circumstances, of a given cognitive disposition. That's what a finked disposition would be if it's a cognitive one. If it's a finked cognitive disposition, okay? Now, one way to regard finkedness scenarios is to say that the pertinent capacities are still present, even though certain further factors also are present that are poised to suppress or override the dispositions that normally would be constitutively tied to these capacities. I suspect John was thinking of it that way, which is why he thought that all this finky stuff was just kind of an analytic philosophy irritant. But in any event, It's controversial. Another take on such scenarios is that the presence of think factors actually eliminates the capacity, or partially eliminates it if the pertinent dispositions are only partially thinked. For present purposes, we need not take a stand on this matter. We can be neutral about it. To say that certain capacity entailing aspects of rich content are defeasibly self-certifying is to say this: insofar as no think factors are in place, behind the scenes and outside of consciousness, a state process cannot possess those aspects of rich content without thereby being guaranteed to meet those content aspects' truth or satisfaction conditions. So now you get a sense for how we're going to try to implement the use of rich content as a way to diffuse the intrinsicness holism dilemma. So section 7 is called filling in the sketch, the holism of seemings. So now we try to put some meat on the bones of the strategy just characterized. Human consciousness includes numerous aspects of intentionality that could fail to be veridical, consistently with the occurrence of those very experiences. It'll be useful for present purposes to consider conscious experiences in a way that bypasses questions of veridicality or non-veridicality regarding those kind of aspects, focusing on residual aspects of the intentionality of consciousness. That, in effect, is what one seeks to do when deploying the Descartes-Husserl approach of radical methodological doubt or bracketing. One's present stretch of a current conscious experience could exist, for instance, even if one did not really have a body, or even if one were not situated in an ambient environment, anything like the kind of environment that's presented to oneself through one's sensory perceptual experience. One could be an invaded brain or a bodiless dreamer being deceived by an evil demon. Likewise, this stretch of consciousness could exist even if one has little or no genuine past and will have little or no genuine future. But even if one or both such radical non-veridicality possibilities happened to obtain, nonetheless, one's current total occurrent conscious state or process during this stretch of consciousness would still include exactly the same intentional seemings as it actually includes. That is, how things would seem to be as regards oneself and one's wider environment and one's apparently bodily engagement with that impaired environment would be just as things actually seem in all those respects to be. All right, so we're going to try to use the bracketing strategy to bracket out what are pretty clear cases of potential non-veridicality of the content of experience. And we want to focus on what you still have after you've done the bracketing. As emphasized above, one's total occurrent conscious experience during a specific stretch of time normally includes much rich content that presents one's being capable of undergoing a fairly wide range of potential, not currently actual conscious states and processes that are content related in various ways to the present contents of consciousness. So how things now seem to be includes present seemings as of having such capacities to undergo such potential experiential states and processes. All right, so consider then the actual seemings that figure in a given stretch of a current consciousness, and also various content-related potential seemings, while regarding all these actual and potential seemings in the Cartesian Husserlian bracketing manner. For example, consider the seemings involved in the experience of seeming to be adding a column of figures on a page. Perhaps there's no real page there with numerals printed on it. Perhaps one doesn't really see figures on a page with numerals printed on it because one has no sense organs and no body. One is, for example, a lifelong invaded brain. Perhaps one won't in fact have experiences as of completing the addition because one will go out of existence within a few seconds. One is a very short-lived invaded brain. Nonetheless, during this stretch of current consciousness, one undergoes adding experiences as we described them earlier, which includes rich hidden phenomenology. One aspect of that hidden phenomenology is as of having the capacity here and now to correctly continue the adding process in response to other visual experiential numeral presentations that I might encounter in focal visual awareness, but that I'm not now encountering. That capacity includes the capacity to undergo various experiential seemings that I'm not now presently undergoing. All right, now ask yourself, barring the presence of some extra conscious think factor, is it introspectively plausible that I could be having this very total occurrent phenomenology, including its occurrent aspect, as of having here and now the capacity to correctly add other potentially experienced numerals to, while yet not really having that capacity here and now? The answer we submit is no. Although I could lose that capacity before having an opportunity to exercise it, say by having a stroke or by instantaneously ceasing to exist, and although my seeming here and now adding capacity could be somehow presently thinked unbeknownst to me, say because a device is implanted in my brain that will cause me to forget how to add were I to see the numeral 3 within the next few seconds, nonetheless, barring any such think factor, I could not be undergoing this current phenomenology as of competently adding unless I really possess at this moment the adding competence that I'm experiencing now possessing and now exercising. In this respect, therefore, the rich content of my occurrent phenomenology, content to the effect that my adding competence extends beyond the adding steps that I'm currently experiencing performing, is defeasibly self-certifying. Unless some think factor is present, I cannot seem to be exercising this competence here and now, not anyway in the phenomenally specific manner in which I now seem to have such competence, and yet fail to have it here and now. Well, in the addition example, it's natural to say that one would really be adding, even if one were an invalid brain, although of course one would not really be adding numerals on a sheet of paper. Other cases are different. Consider, for example, the experience of walking upstairs. If one is an embedded brain undergoing this experience, then of course one isn't really walking upstairs at all. But consider once again the pertinent experiential seemings while doing so in the mode of Cartesian Husserlian bracketing. It'll help to bear in mind that a lifelong embedded brain has all the neural development that underpins coordinated physical bodily activity. You know, if you bear that in mind, then an awful lot of what goes under labels like embodied cognition, with people insisting that you couldn't have the relevant kind of cognition unless you had a body, is just deeply confused. Anyway, back to the text. During a current short stretch of time, what's currently present in consciousness is just an occurrent temporal component of a walking upstairs process. That is a walking upstairs experiential process, a process experientially as of walking upstairs, even if I'm an embedded brain. But here too, there's rich content. For instance, content as of being able competently to continue one's walking process into the short-term future, and indeed in ways that would accommodate various unanticipated eventualities. For example, a loose step not currently in view that would best be stepped over without being stepped upon. Now, since seeming to walk upstairs doesn't constitute really doing so, the aspects of the phenomenology of immediate concern are what might be called the aspects that survive bracketing. These pertain not to walking upstairs per se, but rather to mental goings-on that initiate and guide stair climbing in a being with a suitable body within a suitable environment. The kind of body one experiences oneself to have within the kind of stairway including environment one experiences oneself to be within. So the pertinent bracketed rich content is this: seeming to be able competently to continue one's seeming walking process into the short-term future, and indeed in ways that would accommodate various unanticipated experiential eventualities. In this case, too, one might not continue to possess this bracketed capacity into the short-term future, and therefore one might not actually exercise it in the near-term future. Nevertheless, the key question is this, like in the previous example: barring the presence of some think factor outside of my consciousness, is it introspectively plausible that I could be having this very total occurrent phenomenology, including its occurrent aspect as of having here and now the capacity seemingly to continue competently walking upstairs, while not really having that capacity here and now? The answer we submit is no. Rather, the bracketed content is defeasibly self-certifying. Insofar as I'm not now thinked, I cannot seem to have the here and now capacity to seemingly continue competently walking upstairs without really having that capacity here and now. So that's how we address the dilemma, the holism intrinsicness dilemma. These observations about defeasible holism in the domain of phenomenal seemings we suggest are pervasively generalizable. If one is currently undergoing a conscious experience with phenomenal aspects that have holism entailing truth satisfaction conditions, then insofar as non-actual potential conscious experiences are concerned, and barring think factors, one really has the here and now holistic capacity to undergo such potential conscious experiences. This degree of holism about phenomenal intentionality, we contend, is holism enough. Beyond the domain of seemings, of course, the contents of one's current conscious experiences are not defeasibly self-certifying because one's conscious experiences are susceptible to various kinds of non-veridicality, including radical non-veridicality, as with the invaded brain. But further self-satisfyingness is not needed, precisely because content pertaining to more than non-actual potential seemings is typically susceptible to various kinds of non-veridicality. The upshot is that the intrinsicness holism dilemma has been resolved by deploying, in the domain of actual and potential experiential seemings, the kind of implementation of the rich content strategy that was sketched in section 6. Any holistic truth satisfaction conditions accruing to one's total occurrent conscious state or process are such that, barring think factors, the potential seemings elements of these holistic truth satisfactions are guaranteed to be met. Thus, these potential seemings elements, being defeasibly self-certifying, meet the holistic instantiation conditions of phenomenally intentional states or processes. So that's the reply to the dilemma. Okay, section 8 is very brief. It's called total occurrent conscious states or processes. The following point deserves emphasis in connection with our appeal to rich content. In general, such content accrues to one's total occurrently conscious state or process. This means that pertinent rich content need not necessarily accrue to those aspects of such a total occurrent state that answer to familiar psychological categories, like a current belief that such and such, a current desire for so and so, a current perceptual experience as of thus and such, and the like. The overall phenomenal character of a total occurrently conscious state is typically enormously rich, and thus is richly brimming with inherent phenomenal intentionality. Familiar psychological categories carve out certain salient aspects of a total phenomenal intentional state or process, but typically there are residual aspects too. It's important to keep this fact well in mind. Okay, I think I have time to say something about the last section. What's happened so far is almost entirely John. And This happened after I was no longer living in Memphis and no longer in the Memphis department. And he and I were working somewhat independently along similar tracks. His track was in terms of what he was calling rich content. And he had in mind this particular worry that was not so much on my radar screen here that we call the intrinsicness holism dilemma. Meanwhile, well, here's something I've been thinking about quite a bit. I mentioned briefly in my first talk that John and I stressed the idea of morphological content as important in connection with cognition in terms of accommodating holistic aspects of rational thought, rational belief formation, for example, rational planning. And that was supposed to be content that gets accommodated without getting overtly represented during processing, be automatically accommodated just by virtue of the morphology of the system. Oh, I forgot to mention where the name morphological content came from. I wanted a nice phrase for what I was thinking of. And I thought, well, when you need a nice phrase for something, what do? You go to your colleagues in ancient philosophy. So I went to Tim Roche. I told him what I wanted, and we kicked around terms because, you know, ancient philosophy people are steeped in great languages like Latin and Greek. So he gave me the phrase morphological content. Well, originally when John and I were working on that stuff, I guess I pretty much assumed that if the content is automatically at work without even being overtly represented, just by virtue of the morphology of the system, then it couldn't be conscious in any sense. It couldn't make any relevant difference to conscious experience. And David Henderson and I started making a very big deal about the epistemological importance of morphological content in rational belief formation when we started applying some of these ideas in epistemology. But I realized, well, wait a minute, my deep epistemological sympathies are with some kind of experiential evidentialism. And that's going to be deeply in tension with believing in the epistemic importance of morphological content. If you think that operative morphological content has nothing to do with conscious experience. And as I dwelled in that dilemma, that was my real dilemma, what dawned on me was, I think I was wrong to suppose that if it's automatically operative background content that doesn't even need to get overtly represented in order to be in play in cognition, then it can't have any effect on conscious experience. And so John talked about rich content. What I found myself talking about was something called chromatic illumination. So section 9 here brings in that, chromatic illumination. A phrase that was originally coined in a paper that I wrote with my Slovene colleague Matjaž Potrč, called the epistemic relevance of morphological content. Okay, section 9. As a prelude to what we'll say later in this section, we begin by considering a cartoon by Danny Shanahan that appeared in the New Yorker magazine. I got the date on the handout. I didn't put it into the text, but about 20 years ago. Anyway, I may even get it in there. I'm not sure. Anyhow, about 20 years ago. Two guys are sitting in a bar, and the one who is speaking has an unhappy and exasperated expression on his face. He says to the other guy, he's like this, "What I don't get is how she figured it out that I was having an affair with babysitter." All right. Now getting this joke, or any joke, typically is a phenomenologically instantaneous experience, or at least very quick, if not instantaneous. In that experiential instant, normally one needs to appreciate quite a wide range of pertinent background information. Also, one needs to bring to bear one's own humor sensibility, thereby appreciating why and how all this information combines together in the ways that make for funniness, or otherwise you wouldn't get the joke. But for any reasonably clever joke, typically you can elaborate at some length upon the various items of information, background information, that are pertinent. So, for example, in the example at hand, probably the most salient such item, remember this was 20 years ago now, the one you'd mentioned first in seeking to explain it to somebody who doesn't get it, is that the practice of persistently inserting the word like into unspoken English is, or was, a distinctive feature of the way teenage girls talked in the US back at that time. Nowadays, of course, such like talk is much more prevalent. It's the norm among college students when they are talking to each other, at least. It's relatively common among young adults. We ourselves know some philosophers at the rank of full professor who talk that way. But that wasn't that way back then. Yeah, supposedly it was invented by teenage females in the San Fernando Valley, north of Los Angeles, where lots of teenage fads originate. Valley girls, they're known as. Okay, like talk. That's the essence of the joke. But that's just the beginning in terms of background information that must be grasped in the instant in order to get the joke. Additional such items of information can be made salient by posing suitable questions. You know, ones that might be asked by somebody who's persistently deficient at understanding jokes. Whose children did this babysitter care for? Roughly how old is the babysitter? How did the opportunity arise for the guy to have an affair with the babysitter? Who's the she who figured out that the guy is having an affair with the babysitter? How did that person react upon learning this fact? Why is the guy upset that she figured it out and reacted that way? Here's one that I really like. Why doesn't he himself understand how she figured it out? And of course, what's so funny about all this? You could write a monograph about the pertinent background information and its holistic relevance. Likewise for most any even moderately subtle joke. Okay, well now the point is supposed to be that somehow in order to understand the joke and find it funny, you got to be appreciating all these bits of background information and how they are relevant and holistically combined for funniness. But it's not phenomenologically plausible that they all are overtly represented in consciousness, but somehow their operativeness seems to be affecting the phenomenological character of experience. That's what Perturch and I called chromatic illumination. The inspiration for that phrase, I was thinking about a quite specific painting, a famous one by Toulouse-Lautrec, which hangs in the Art Institute at Chicago Art Institute of Art, called At the Moulin Rouge. You know, he did all these paintings of people in that famous nightclub in Paris called the Moulin Rouge. And in this particular one, you've got various figures in the painting illuminated in quite striking ways. And the sources of some of this illumination are not represented in the painting, but the way the figures are illuminated, as it were, implicates these offstage sources. And so that's why I like the expression chromatic illumination as sort of a metaphorical characterization of information that is appreciated consciously without being overtly represented. Now, so the final suggestion in here is that lots of the rich content that John was talking about plausibly operates in conscious experience without necessarily even being overtly represented. I mean, think about the example of adding numbers, for example. Of course, you know that you're adding. You know what the rules for adding are and so forth. Do you need to be overtly representing these things, even in a way that's not focally in conscious awareness? Not necessarily. And in fact, given the things that John and I said about reasons to think that lots of cognition needs to operate in the morphological way, it's plausible that rich content quite typically takes the form of chromatic illumination. I'm just kind of quickly summarizing what happens in the last part of the paper. Okay, I'm done.